Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeology. Today is the official 20th video and unofficial 14th video in my series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. The subjects of this video are the Kiowa and Comanche nations on the Texas plains in the early imperial United States. So right off the bat, those of us in the modern world, especially the modern United States, when we hear the word Texas, we think of the state of Texas within the United States as it is now. And of course, this is not an inaccurate way to look at things. After all, Texas has held its political boundaries within the United States for 150 years. So obviously, the Texas is only known the way that we know it today because everyone alive today only knows Texas as it looks like on this map. However, while that's a valid way to look at it, it is not the uh, full picture. Texas only took on these political boundaries after a long series of events, processes, and catalysts. So, in order to get a better look at the larger picture of how Texas took on this shape in terms of political boundaries, we need to go back a little bit further in time to get a better look at the larger picture. Starting by looking at the Comanche and other related Native American cultures before and up to early European contact, starting with the ancient origins of the Kiowa and Comanche peoples. So the ancestors of the Kiowa peoples were Proto-Kiowa Tonawin speaking peoples, which you can see here on this graph, who began to show up as a distinctive cultural group during the basket maker culture, which itself existed as a distinctive cultural entity, cultural group between 1500 BCE and 750 CE. And they were located in these regions here in New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah, as you can see on this map here. And they lived in villages and pit house dwellings such as this here. And they, of course, get their name from the baskets found in archaeological excavations that bear very distinctive ways that they are constructed, which you can see uh, in these pictures here. And the basket maker culture is also known to have created several different petroglyphs and petroglyph sites, as you can see in this picture here. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about petroglyphs a little bit later in the video. Then the Proto-Kiowa Tonawin ancestors of the Kiowa people would become part of the Fremont culture, which existed as a distinct cultural entity somewhere between 1 CE to 1300 CE. And they mainly were located in the region that is now Utah, but also parts of Colorado and I believe this is Nevada over here. And as you can see on this map here, the Fremont culture most certainly had contact with the basket maker culture and the ancestral Puebloans who succeeded the basket maker culture. Uh, that being said, the Fremont culture did not always stay in the area that is Utah, which is technically part of the North American Southwest. The Fremont culture would actually migrate into the northwestern Great Plains sometime in the 1300s CE, which is backed up by a variety of different pieces of archaeological evidence. For example, archaeological evidence shows a shift in the utilization of obsidian sources in southern Utah northward to southern Colorado sometime between 1100 and 1300 CE, as shown in this map here and this graph here. Furthermore, there are shared characteristics between petroglyphs in Montana and Fremont petroglyphs, which you can see in this graph here. And here are some pictures of Fremont petroglyphs in Utah, and here as well. And then here is a picture of petroglyphs from Wyoming that share and if not copy the same motifs that are present in the Fremont petroglyphs here and here. Furthermore, archaeological excavations of sites in southern Idaho and western Wyoming dated to 1300 CE yielded basketry indicative of the Fremont culture, as discussed in a paper simply titled Fremont Basketry by James Adovasio et al. And also archaeologists have noted similarities in the layout between settlements in the northwestern Great Plains and the Fremont culture, which, of course, by itself doesn't necessarily mean anything, but when stacked on top of all of the other evidence that I just mentioned, it's pretty indicative of a migration of the Fremont people, of the Fremont culture into the northwestern Great Plains. And you can see again that those similarities here. Then at the same time as the Fremont culture was migrating into the northwestern Great Plains, the Shoshonean peoples were also expanding into the northwestern Great Plains between 1400 and 1600 CE. With the ancestors of the Comanche being specifically part of the Shoshone peoples who were migrating into this region. And this is evidenced by a variety of different pieces of archaeological evidence, as discussed by Cody Newton in his paper titled Towards a Context for Late Pre-Contact Culture Change, Comanche Movement Prior to the 18th Century Spanish Documentation. And in this, he looks at the similarities between Comanche projectile points and Shoshone projectile points, as well as pottery, as well as migration patterns and settlement patterns, which you can see here in this map here. Then, towards the end of the migrations of the ancestors of the Kiowa and the ancestors of the Comanche into the northwestern Great Plains would come major turning points in their history, starting with the Spanish colonization of the American Southwest, after which the Spanish Empire would implement the brutal encomienda system in the Southwest, which was essentially the equivalent of chattel slavery, with the Spanish claiming that the encomienda system would benefit both settlers and Native Americans. But of course, it didn't work out that way. So the plan was Spanish settlers would protect and care for and Christianize Native Americans, and Native Americans would work for a portion of their time for Spanish settlers. However, the reality was Spanish settlers forced long labor, didn't pay Native American workers, failed to or outright refused to protect Native Americans, and seized Native American lands. And Native Americans would die from disease and harsh living and working conditions. The encomienda system would actually be protested by and ended by the Catholic missionaries, as well as ended by Native American revolts. However, when the Spanish replaced the encomienda system with the repartimiento system, nothing changed. Essentially, it was the encomienda system, only a different name. But another byproduct on top of the encomienda system of the Spanish Empire's colonization of the North American Southwest would be the early dispersal of an early reintroduction of horses into North America. And I say this because horses did exist in North America until about 6,000 years ago or so, when they went extinct due to a variety of reasons, such as climate change and hunting and things like that. In this the early dispersal of horses and reintroduction of horses into North America, into the Americas overall, is discussed in length by this paper by William Timothy Terrell Taylor et al., titled Early Dispersals of Domestic Horses into the Great Plains and Northern Rockies, where they look at a variety of different evidences such as bit wear and other types of wear, genetic distance, as well as archaeological evidence on top of that. After the dispersal and reintroduction of horses into North America, the Native Americans of the Great Plains would quickly become horse riding societies, as you can see here and here and in the previous picture. And this in turn would lead to the migration of the Comanche onto the southern Great Plains sometime between the late 1690s and 1706 CE, as you can see here on this map, where they would break off from their Shoshone ancestors, their Shoshone parent culture, and migrate into the southern Great Plains of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. With the earliest contact between the Comanche Nation and the Spanish Empire in New Mexico and Texas beginning sometime between the late 1690s to 1706 CE. After which Taos Pueblo in New Mexico would become a center for trade with the Comanche Nation. But it would not all be peaceful, as Comanche warriors would launch several large-scale raids against Spanish New Mexico and Texas, often defeating the outnumbered and ill-equipped and ill-experienced Spanish garrisons. And these long campaigns would happen between 1716 and 1786 CE. And I've already done an in-depth video on these early campaigns that I will link in the iCard. And you can see these raids and campaigns here on these maps, as well as trading events. Eventually, a smallpox epidemic would break out and reduce the Native American population in North America, including that of the Comanche Nation. This epidemic, plus a realization by the Spanish Empire and the Comanche Nation that they have other interests and enemies, would lead to moves toward peace by both parties sometime between 1780 and 1781 CE. Eventually, a peace treaty would be negotiated with the Eastern Comanche Nation, which included large gifts to the Comanche Nation and the return by the Comanche Nation of all Spanish prisoners they have held captive, ending hostilities between the Comanche Nation and the Spanish Empire in Texas, with this treaty being signed in 1785 CE. And then just 1 year after that, after two meetings at Pecos and another in a Comanche camp, a peace treaty is signed between the Comanche Nation and the Spanish New Mexico, which is then sent to Mexico City. And then, as a result of this, a truce between the Ute Nation and the Comanche Nation is also negotiated, and the Comanche Nation forms an alliance with the Spanish Empire against the Apache Nation, which is often hostile to the Spanish Empire. This agreement ends major hostilities between the Comanche Nation and the Spanish Empire in New Mexico, with the treaty being ratified in July 1786 CE. Then, very shortly after this alliance is formed and the treaty is ratified, a joint Comanche-Spanish expedition would be launched against the Apache in 1786 CE, with a large number of about 900 Comanche warriors participating in this campaign, which you can see in these graphs here, in these tables here, as well as here. Then, as the Comanche Wars with the Spanish Empire were winding down and coming to an end, the Kiowa people would begin to migrate onto the southern Great Plains between 1700 and the early 1790s CE, with the Kiowa people breaking off from their Proto-Kiowa Tanoan ancestors and gradually migrating into northern Texas, western Oklahoma, western Nebraska, and southeastern Colorado and northeastern New Mexico, sometime in the early 1700s CE, which you can see here on this map. Eventually finishing their migration and forming the Kiowa Nation in the early 1790s CE, while also forming a permanent military alliance with the Comanche Nation. Also, the Kiowa Nation would go on to form close ties with the Plains Apache, located here in Oklahoma, who were oftentimes called the Kiowa Apache, even though they are not linguistically or genetically related to the Kiowa. They are just simply called this because of their close political relationship with the Kiowa. And again, this closer relationship would develop in the early 1790s CE. With the ending of hostilities between the Spanish Empire and the Comanche Nation, the Spanish Empire would begin to shower the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation with gifts while removing trade restrictions on guns and ammunition. This would then allow for a new class of traders called Comancheros to transport Spanish goods into the Comanche heartland in the Texas Panhandle and trade for buffalo robes, meat, and horses, which in turn would lead to 30 years of relative peace, though, of course, sporadic raids would still occur, though not large-scale military raids that had been seen in the previous years from 1706 to 1786. Now we come to our next section, the Comanche and the Society of the Comanche and Kiowa Nations. Starting with Comanche culture. So for one thing, much like modern American society, Comanche culture is a patrilineal society, meaning kinship and descent is traced through the father's line. For example, again, much like modern American society, I take my father's last name, I have my father's last name, and I trace my descent through my father's line. Comanche society and culture was a patrilocal society, meaning when a young couple married, they would live in the husband's home or community. Women would be in charge of the day-to-day duties within the community, such as collecting varieties of wild berries and fruit, and the processing of them with prepared meats to make a type of food called pemmican. And of course, they would also be in charge of taking care of the camp while the men were away. Men, in turn, would be the chiefs, warriors, and hunters. And then there are 3 levels of socio-political integration in traditional pre-reservation Comanche society. The first being the extended family group, which has no size limits, but kinship is recognized. Kinship recognition is limited to relatives 2 generations above and 3 generations below. Then after that would come the local band, which is local bands, which are comprised of 1 or more extended family group, one of which forms its core. The band is the primary social unit of the Comanche. A typical band might number several hundred people. It is a family group centered around a group of men, all of whom are relatives, sons, brothers, or cousins. Since marriage with a relative is forbidden, wives come from another group, and sisters leave to join their husbands. Then, after that, is the division, which comprise several local groups linked by kinship, and political, medicine, and military relationships, as well as common interest in hunting, gathering, war, peace, and trade. And here are my sources for that information here. Next, we need to take a look at the culture of the Kiowa Nation. So, for one thing, unlike the Comanche Nation, the Kiowa Nation followed and still follows a bilateral line of descent, meaning both the maternal and paternal lines are significant, in contrast to, say, for example, paternal lines, patrilineal lines, where lines of descent where the paternal line is the important line, or in matrilineal lines of descent where the maternal line is the important line of descent. The Kiowa Nation did not have any clans, but did have a complex kinship-based system and societies based on age and gender. Like the Comanche Nation, women were in charge of the day-to-day duties of the community, such as collecting varieties of wild berries, fruit, as well as the processing of them with prepared meats to make pemmican. And of course, they also took care of the camp while men were away. Kiowa men would, in contrast to the Comanche Nation, would actually live in the families of their wives' extended families. And then, of course, men would, within the Kiowa Nation, much like the Comanche Nation, would become the chiefs, warriors, and hunters. Like the Comanche Nation, the pre-reservation society of the Kiowa Nation had three levels of socio-political integration, which were local groups, small communities led by a group leader. Then after that would be the band, which was several combined local groups. And then there would be political subdivisions, of which there were two, these being the cold people to the north and the hot people to the south. And all the information uh, the sources I got all this information from are here. Now it is time to take a look at the warfare of the Comanche and Kiowa nations. So, for one thing, warfare took the form of raiding to acquire wealth and prestige. Furthermore, the redistribution of raiding items to kin members as well as non-kin members it was the basis to gain political power and supporters. Men often took risks seeking glory and status. Horse stealing and revenge were common reasons for conducting a raid to take plunder, captives, and war trophies. Any man could organize a raid, but usually he had to have a reputation to gather a sufficient following. Raid leaders had absolute authority during the raid. The raid spoils belonged to the raid leader, who would then divide the plunder to demonstrate his generosity and enhance his reputation. Warfare among the Comanche and Kiowa Nation involved coordinated attacks. Similar to all Native American nations of the Great Plains, warfare was conducted to acquire new territory and resources, or to defend those assets against invasion. A custom common to all Native American nations is something called counting coup, in which the object was simply to touch an enemy in battle without hurting him. A special coup stick was sometimes used for this purpose, although a war club, a lance, a bow, or even the hand of a warrior himself would do. An eagle feather would be awarded to the warrior for each coup they counted. If after counting coup on an armed enemy, the warrior managed to kill him and then scalp him, the warrior would receive 3 coup feathers. Capturing an enemy's possessions, especially eagle feathers, brought great honor and was arguably the thing that would bring the most honor. Here is the sources that I got all that information from. And here's an example, a picture showing an example of the types of feathers received for each type of coup and each number of coup that were counted. And here's another one here. Now, something that needs to be addressed because of its connection to Comanche and to the warfare of the Comanche and the Kiowa Nation, is the treatment of captives by the Comanche and Kiowa Nation. For one thing, captives, especially women and children, were often captured by the Comanche and Kiowa warriors in raids as a way to gain status and prestige. However, despite propaganda by the Spanish Empire, by Mexico, the Republic of Texas, and the United States, rape was practically non-existent. Now, this does not mean it didn't happen. I mean, you know, never say never. However, it was very, 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 very rare. And this was primarily due to the strict rules of abstinence during raids and warfare. Furthermore, while journeying to the Comanche and Kiowa villages could be difficult due to the environment of the Great Plains, and harsh punishments such as whippings by women of high status in villages could happen, and sometimes did happen. Captives generally were far more often treated well and eventually adopted into the nation. This can be seen in the experiences of Cynthia Ann Parker, who embraced the Comanche people as her people after her capture, and Maria Caudell, who was treated as the daughter of a Comanche woman. Furthermore, even women who escaped captivity from the Comanche and Kiowa nations, such as Dolly Webster, stated that the Comanche and Kiowa treated them kindly, which is very important because, again, even people who actively were trying to get away from the Comanche and Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation were telling white Americans, among as well as Spanish soldiers, Mexican soldiers, etc., how despite their capture they were being treated respectfully and kindly by the Comanche and Kiowa villages that they were taken to. And here are all the sources that I got this information from. Now we need to take a look at Comanche and Kiowa warriors as well as their weapons in the 1800s CE. For one thing, Comanche and Kiowa warriors generally looked something like these pictures here, of course with great variation. For example, this is a high status warrior based off of the number of eagle feathers he has. Not everyone could wear a headdress like this. You had to gain a lot of prestige and a lot of honors to do that. But you get the idea. Generally, this is what Comanche and Kiowa warriors would look like during this period of time. And the weapons that they used varied from things like war clubs, including this mace-like war club here, or this stone axe war club, or metal pipe tomahawks that, as I've said several times in the previous videos in this series, tomahawks are a subset of the weapon type known as a war club. So they would, of course, use these tomahawks as war clubs. And then the Comanche and Kiowa were also known for their skill with bows and arrows, with the Comanche actually being known for their specific type of bow that they used, called the Comanche bow, and of course being horse-bound warriors, one of the most effective weapons while on horseback, basically across the world, in the Americas, in Europe, and Asia, etc., are spears and lances. And so, unsurprisingly, being horsebound warriors, the Comanche and the Kiowa warriors would use lances and spears to great effect. And then after contact with European empires, as well as the United States, the Comanche and Kiowa nations would adopt steel and iron knives. Again, as I have said several times in previous videos, um, as well as in my video on pre-contact Native American metallurgy, which I will include in the iCard. Uh, Before contact with Europeans, Native Americans did indeed practice metallurgy. They just did not have steel or iron metallurgy. That is what was adopted after contact with Europeans, and that can be seen in the use of steel and iron knives, as seen here. At least one Comanche chief, one Comanche war chief, is noted to have been given and used a Spanish saber in battle. And then, of course, the most well-known item that was adopted after contact with European empires by all Native American nations, not just the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation, is that of firearms, gunpowder weapons, such as this musket seen here. Now it is time to take a look at the Comanche social and political positions. So, for one thing, there were leaders who led any particular camp or group. Then there were chiefs who were the central men of a local band. Uh, After their deaths, one of the other men took their place. If none were available, the band members might drift apart to other groups where they might have relatives or establish new relations by marrying an existing member. There was also no separate term for status of peace chief or war chief because any man leading a war party was considered a war chief. Then there was a council, the governing body of a village, which was formed by the adult men of a village, though not all adult men participated, and was led by the chief of the village. The council would meet both formally and informally to discuss matters of public concern. Councils of representatives of different bands would also meet to discuss matters concerning multiple bands. Then there was the concept of medicine power, which was a religious practice available to both men and women centered on acquiring medicine power from supernatural beings. Medicine power resided nearly everywhere, but not in equal amounts. Some sources, such as the sun, earth, or the father, have intrinsic power. Peyote and cedar also had intrinsic power, as do animals with exceptional physical strength and abilities. I should say have. These are spiritual beliefs still held by the Comanche Nation and Comanche people. Uh, thus, eagles, bears, coyotes, skunks, bisons, wolves, antelopes, and opossums are considered especially endowed with intrinsic power, although any animal can conceivably be a source of medicine power, but not necessarily the same amount. Both sexes can become a possessor of power, uh, and power can be obtained by vision questing, by transfer, inheritance, purchase, or training. Another way to achieve power is to visit the grave of a possessor of power to seek their personal power. Sundance leaders also seek visions and sought visions, particularly when seeking information about the future or lost relatives. And medicine power can also be obtained in dreams. With that in mind, there were groups known as medicine societies, which were small groups of men and women who shared, and I believe this still happens, who share the same medicine power. If there are any members of the Comanche Nation watching this, please feel free to correct me on any of this information. Then, after that, are warriors. And this is because for men in Comanche society, social status and prestige was through acquiring a war record. The most valued members of Comanche society were young males who were skilled in war and horsemanship. In camp, they would be given comfort and afforded many privileges, as it was commonly believed that they would die early. The ultimate honor was death at the hands of an enemy. Individual men desired to distinguish themselves in war and raiding to become a warrior. Because again, this was a social title that one would receive. To be considered a warrior by the community was the ideal. Um, a warrior was one who faced the enemy even when dismounted. Within this context, there were different soldier societies, uh, which were groups of men whose primary ritual context was a ceremony to recruit volunteers for revenge war expeditions. They also acted in lawmaking and law enforcement capacities, such as enforcing hunting policies, making sure warriors didn't break their promises to go to war, to go on military expeditions. Examples of these societies include, but are not limited to, the Little Pony Society, the Big Horse People, the Black Knife People, and the Wolves. And then, of course, within that is the War Party, which were intra and inter band efforts, war parties being groups of warriors assembled by the chief uh, of a community with the goal of going on a military expedition or expeditions. And here are the sources that I got all this information on this slide and the previous slide from. Uh, the Comanche Nation also had several different status symbols, such as, and I apologize to any members of the Comanche Nation who may be watching this for probably butchering this, but one of these status symbols is the piano pie, which is a sort of crooked, jagged club, which you can see here. There were also various types of spears that could be used as status symbols called crooked spears, called that way for the type of fabric wrapped around them that sort of made the shaft of the spear look crooked in a variety of different ways. And of course, being that the buffalo was one of the central uh, like building blocks of Comanche society, buffalo hats and headdresses were also uh, could also become status symbols for high-ranking Comanche warriors, uh, as seen also here with this buffalo headdress, and also as connected to counting coup was the bestowing upon of eagle feathers and eventually eagle headdresses, which again were very high status symbols that could not be worn by everyone within the Comanche Nation. Only individuals who reached high ranks and high amounts of prestige would be bestowed these items. Now we need to look at the Kiowa social and political positions. First, there are the chiefs, who were the leaders of the bands and divisions who maintained law and order and gave protection from enemies. Then, after that, were the group leaders, who were the leaders of the local groups. Then, below that, were the war chiefs, who were military leaders who rose to prominence by leading successful war parties and performing acts of bravery. However, they must have the confidence of their followers, and they were democratically elected. Then, within each village was the council, which was the governing body of each village that was formed by the adult men of a village, though not all men participated. And each council was led by the chief uh, of the division or the village. The council would meet both formally and informally to discuss matters of public concern. Councils of representatives of different bands would also meet to discuss matters of concern to multiple bands. Within the Kiowa Nation and Kiowa society, there were multiple war societies. Uh, where young men could prove their bravery and skill or display their worth in battle would often be invited to one of these warrior societies. In addition to warfare, the societies would work to keep peace within the bands and the nation as a whole. The first of these warrior societies uh, were the Little Rabbits, which were for young boys, and it mostly served as a social and educational group for young boys, which involved no violence or combat. After that came the Young Sheep Society, which consisted of young men with little to no experience in war, and this society served as a finishing school for skills gained in the Little Rabbit Society, uh, and skills that were needed to become an accomplished warrior. After that came the Horse Headdress Society. This group's main duties were to act as police, uh, with the society not requiring war honors, meaning that most of its members had few or limited war honors. Then there was the Blacklegs Society, which was composed of martially and socially high ranking men, and it did require war honors for membership. Many chiefs, warriors, and medicine men were members of this society. Then the one above all of these societies were the Sentinel Scout Dogs, also known as Big Dogs. There's various different names for the society that involve the word dogs. And this society was associated with warfare and included several of the leading war chiefs and peace chiefs, and its members were selected for conspicuous bravery and merit, and consisted of the 10 most elite warriors of all of the Kiowa, who were elected by the members of the other adult warrior societies. And it was considered the bravest of the Kiowa military societies. And here are the sources that I got this information from here and on the previous slide. Now it is time for us to take a look at Comanche and Kiowa villages. So generally, Comanche and Kiowa villages looked probably how you would expect villages of Native Americans on the Great Plains to look. The primary form of habitation was that of the teepee, which, while it looks simple, was a very ingeniously designed form of habitation, which could be quickly constructed and deconstructed. And it was well designed for movement across the plains and following the bison herds. And it was also designed to be very easily cooled in the summer and very easily heated in the winter, and could sleep an entire family. Now it is time to look at the economy of the Comanche and Kiowa nations. So, for one thing, the Comanche and Kiowa hunted animals such as, well, for one thing, the bison, uh, which is the primary food and primary game animal of the Comanche and Kiowa nations, of the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation. But they would also hunt deer, pronghorn, and elk. And the Comanche and Kiowa people would also gather wild plants such as pecans, prickly pears, mulberries, and persimmons. Also, while they did not practice agriculture, the Comanche and Kiowa nations would trade with other Native American nations, such as the Pawnee Nation, for crops such as corn and squash. And the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation were also major participants in the trade between Native American nations and the European empires, which can be seen on these maps here and here, with the main trade goods by the Comanche and Kiowa nations being buffalo hides and horses, which they would then take to European and eventually United States trade markets to trade for European trade goods such as iron cooking utensils, guns, steel knives, as well as European candies. And you can see, we can actually see just how big this trade between the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation and European empires was based off of records from, for example, the Spanish Empire on the amount of trade goods exchanged between the Comanche and Kiowa nations and the Spanish Empire, as seen in this table here and here, as well as here. Now, with that in mind, it is time to look at the collapse of the Spanish Empire in the Southwest and the rise of the Republic of Mexico. So, inspired by the French and Haitian revolutions, insurgents such as Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, Ignacio Allende, and Ignacio Lopez Rayon would separately and sometimes together, but oftentimes independently, attempt and eventually successfully overthrow the Spanish rule in Mexico between 1810 and 1821 CE. And this would eventually lead to the establishment of the short-lived First Mexican Empire, which only lasted between 1821 and 1823 CE, which would then be very quickly followed by the First Mexican Republic, which would last a little bit longer from 1824 to 1835 CE. And you can see that here. However, the First Republic of Mexico had no resources to continue paying tribute to the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation due to being embroiled in domestic political disputes, rather than paying attention to the troubles on its northern frontier. In response, the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation launched repeated large-scale raids into Mexico to great effect. And you can see the course of those raids, the routes of those raids here on this map here. And you can see they penetrated very deep into the Republic of Mexico. Which actually brings us to our next section, an influx of outsiders into Mexican Texas. Starting with the migration of Native Americans from the east, such as Cherokee and Lenape, led by Cherokee Chief Bowles, who migrated into Mexico and established the Texas Cherokee Nation at Nacogdoches in the early 1820s CE. And this was done primarily because of Mexico being unable to properly pay attention to its frontier in Mexico. And also, as I discussed in my video on this subject, on the Texas Cherokee that I will include in the iCard, the Republic of Mexico actually agreed to negotiate a settlement plan with the Texas Cherokee, who, upon entering Mexican Texas, would begin to encroach on the hunting lands of the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation, leading to sporadic warfare between the Eastern Native Americans and the Comanche and Kiowa nations. Now, I do want to say that I don't believe that this is a Cherokee in this picture, but you get the general idea. This is showing individuals hunting who are definitely not Comanche or Kiowa, hunting buffalo and encroaching on Comanche and Kiowa hunting lands. Meanwhile, in the hopes that an influx of settlers could control the Comanche raids, the bankrupt Mexican government would go on to encourage immigration into the region, which would be especially appealing for white Americans in the United States, which was still recovering from the economic panic of 1819 CE. These white Americans, finally able to settle legally in Texas, would migrate to Texas and would soon vastly outnumber the Tejanos, or the Mexican-born residents of Texas, with these migrations happening between 1825 and 1835 CE. Now, to be fair, there were earlier migrations, but they were small in number. The largest and most continued migrations of white Americans into Texas happened during this 10-year time span between 1825 and 1835 CE. Meanwhile, to the in the northern part of the domain of the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation, rising tensions between the Kiowa Nation and the Osage Nation would eventually lead Osage leader Black Dog to launch an attack on a Kiowa village. Black Dog's warriors would then successfully attack the village and cut off the heads of their victims, arranging them in rows of brass cooking buckets, and then also would take the Kiowa's sacred medicine bundle with them, with this attack happening in 1833 CE. And this event is actually memorialized on a Kiowa winter count, winter counts being a type of calendar and record keeping device that is painted on buffalo hide more often than not, and is a type of record keeping device used by most Native American tribes of Native American nations of the Great Plains. In response to the Osage attack and the theft of their sacred medicine bundle, the Kiowa and their Comanche allies launched retaliatory raids against the Osage. This picture actually depicts a Comanche warrior on the right here pursuing an Osage warrior on the left. The Kiowa and the Comanche warriors during these raids would demand the return of the Kiowa's sacred medicine bundle, which Black Dog would eventually return. After these attacks, Kiowa chief Little Bluff would become the principal chief of the entire Kiowa Nation in 1834 CE. Then in 1835 CE, several Comanche chiefs, including Iron Jacket, would meet with United States Dragoons at the Wichita Mountains to negotiate a peace treaty with the United States. Which now brings us to our next section, the Texas Revolution. So the Texas Revolution really got its start when Santa Anna overthrew the first Mexican Republic and established the Centralist Republic of Mexico on October 23rd, 1835 CE. Now, I say really got its start. There are other things that caused the Texas Revolution that happened before this, but this was sort of like the big major nail in the coffin that eventually caused it, which I will talk about in my video in the series about the Texas Revolution. Then, shortly after Santa Anna's overthrow of the First Mexican Republic and establishment of the Centralist Mexican Republic, Texas, led by white Americans, would defeat Santa Anna in the Texas Revolution between 1835 and 1836 CE. And while the Texas Revolution was happening, Comanche and Kiowa warriors would raid Fort Parker, killing 5 men and capturing 5 women and children, including Cynthia Ann Parker, who is seen here. Which actually brings us to our next section, the Comanche and Kiowa relations with the Republic of Texas. So, after the Texas Revolution and the establishment of the Republic of Texas, the first president of Texas, Sam Houston, who was a longtime proponent of peaceful coexistence between the Native Americans and white Americans, would negotiate with the Comanche Nation with the objective of establishing a firm border between the American settlers and the Comanche Nation, with these negotiations happening between 1836 and 1838 CE. Shortly after the negotiations between the Comanche Nation and the Republic of Texas, with Sam Houston, the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation would send a delegation to negotiate a peace treaty with their longtime enemies, the Cheyenne Nation and the Arapaho Nation. Participants within this delegation included prominent Comanche chief Tin Bears and prominent Kiowa chief Sitting Bear, with these negotiations and the subsequent peace treaty being signed in 1840 CE. Meanwhile, at the same time, or the relative same time that this peace treaty between the Kiowa and Comanche nations and the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations was being signed, the second president of Texas, Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, a longtime proponent of Indian removal, would invite 65 Comanche, including several prominent Comanche chiefs led by prominent Comanche chief Mukworu, to San Antonio, Texas. The Comanche would then arrive unarmed with captives in tow to be returned to the Republic of Texas, with this meeting specifically happening on March 19th, 1840 CE. However, unsatisfied with the number of captives returned, the Texas garrison would proceed to massacre the Comanche delegation, killing 35 Comanche and capturing 29 more. Meanwhile, the Texas garrison only lost 7 men. This event would become known as the Council House Fight. Now, with that in mind, there is something that must absolutely be addressed in connection to the Council House Fight, and that is the myth of Mathilda Lockhart. So what do I mean by the myth of Mathilda Lockhart? Well, essentially what this myth is for well over 100 years, the outbreak of the Council House Fight has been, and a lot of times still is, blamed on the supposed torture of white American Mathilda Lockhart at the hands of the Comanche. However, the accounts of this torture come from sources published 50 years after the fact, which in itself, is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, because sometimes primary sources are written years after the fact. However, that would only be a valid argument if that was the case, if there were no other sources. The thing is, there are other sources that are contemporary with the Council House Fight itself. And these sources all contradict all contradict the sources that mention the torture of Mathilda Lockhart, with these sources mentioning no evidence of the torture or the physical condition of Mathilda Lockhart herself. One of these is actually a letter from Mathilda Lockhart's sister-in-law, Catherine Lockhart, to her mother, Miss Elizabeth Barton. And so we are actually going to read the letter right now. And the letter reads, Dear Mother, I again write to you having not having received no letter for several months. I am happy to inform you that Andrew Lockhart has at last succeeded in getting his daughter from the Indians. They brought in a little boy to Bexar who was taken at the same time as she was, and proposed a treaty to which the whites agreed on the condition that they would fetch in all the prisoners in their possession. They returned to their camps, and in a few days returned with Mathilda Lockhart only. The American officers met with them in the council house, and the Indians informed them they were to consider themselves prisoners until they were brought in. They drew their bows and arrows, which they had concealed under their buffalo skins, and commenced using of them. Which pause right here. If that was really the case, you would think that the Texas garrison would have lost more than just 7 men, and that there would have been less uh, Comanche killed. Anyways, uh, the Americans being quite unarmed, again, you would think if that was the case, less Comanche would have been killed. uh, the Americans, being quite unarmed, were obliged to use rock axes or anything they could get a hold of. There were 6 Americans and about 30 Indians killed. 21 squaws kept to let them know the result. Since which time they have returned with 2 American children and 7 Mexicans. They exchange equal number and will retain the rest until they are all brought in, or as many as they have in their possession. Miss Webster made her escape about the same time Mathilda Lockhart left, carrying with her her daughter, 4 years old, a sickly child, and living on prickly pear apples, and being 12 days in reaching Bexar. We still look forward to the time when came will be at peace with all our enemies and our country free. Love each to you all affectionately, your daughter, Catherine W. Lockhart, Miss Elizabeth Barton. And as you can see in this letter, while most certainly Matilda Lockhart is mentioned, no mention at all of her torture or her supposed torture appears in this letter, even a little bit. uh, and to be fair, something that's even more condemning of this myth of Matilda Lockhart's torture uh, is the fact that uh, Catherine Lockhart was by no means unwilling to mention things involving the Comanche, and was by no means unwilling to uh, paint white Americans as victims. After all, she paints a very inaccurate picture of the white American Texan garrison being unarmed, which again contradicts the whole result of the Council House fight with the sheer number of Comanche killed compared to the number of the Texas garrison killed. So you would think, since she's willing to mention and paint the Texas garrison as victims, why isn't she mentioning the tortures or supposed tortures in physical condition of Matilda Lockhart? Uh, the answer is her torture never happened. And this is further backed up by newspapers from the Texas Republic from just a couple of months after the Council House fight, as seen in the Morning Star newspaper from Houston, Texas, that was published on Friday, May 22nd, 1840, that you can pause to read here, that mentions the Council House fight, but again, makes absolutely no mention of, not only does it not mention Matilda Lockhart's torture or her physical condition, it doesn't mention Matilda Lockhart at all. Now, I know that my bringing this up is probably going to make a lot of Texas citizens angry, because this myth of Matilda Lockhart, it has been and is still so prominent within the Texas uh, sort of popular history. But that doesn't change, no matter how popular that is, and no matter how common this myth is within Texas popular history, it doesn't change the fact that the primary documents from the period, from the same, not only the same year, but from only a couple of months after the event itself, these primary documents make no mention of Matilda Lockhart, or if they do mention Matilda Lockhart, they make no mention of her physical condition or her supposed torture, especially, which is especially condemning, considering that people like, say, Catherine Lockhart had every reason to mention the physical condition and torture of Mathilda Lockhart, which shows that it did not happen. In response to the Council House fight, Comanche war chiefs Buffalo Hump, Old Owl, Santa Anna, not to be mistaken with the Mexican president and military commander Santa Anna, Yellow Wolf, Amorous Man, and Isa Manica would lead 400 Comanche warriors to attack the towns of Victoria and Linville, where the Comanche warriors would sack the cities, kill several white Americans, and would capture large amounts of goods, with this event becoming known as the Great Raid of 1840 CE. In response to the Great Raid of 1840 CE, the Texas Rangers would pursue and attempt to defeat the Comanche, led by Buffalo Hump and the other war chiefs at the Battle of Plum Creek. However, the Texas Rangers would be unable to advance on the Comanche position, which would lead to the Comanches suffering minimal casualties and being able to make off with the majority of the items that they captured at Victoria and Linville, which would make the Comanche raid a success and would make the Texas Rangers' attempt at retaliation a failure, with this battle specifically happening on August 12th, 1840 CE. And again, much like the myth of Mathilda Lockhart, I'm sure this is going to make a lot of Texas citizens angry, because in a lot of history books and a lot of documentaries, this battle is portrayed as a Texas victory. However, when you actually look at the events of the battle, and taking consideration that the Comanche were in no way trying to like conquer Texas and were only launching the raid to perform some sort of retaliation on Texas for the Council House fight, as well as to capture goods for prestige. And when you look at the fact that they did that, and their goal was not to conquer Texas, and the fact that the Texas Rangers were unable to capture the majority of the goods, or were unable to recapture the majority of the goods, and the Comanche lost very few warriors in this raid. None of that at all sounds like a Texas victory. You can call it a victory. The Texas Army can call it a victory all they want, but sometimes, you can sometimes that doesn't calling something a victory doesn't make it a victory. I can call my computer that I'm on right now a telephone. That doesn't make it a telephone. Things like that. Then, just 4 years after the Council House fight and the Great Raid of 1840, peace between the Eastern Native Americans and the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation would be negotiated in the Treaty of Tehuacana Creek, with this treaty being specifically signed on October 9th, 1844 CE. Meanwhile, Texas President Mirabeau Lamar would dispatch Texas Rangers to raid Comanche and Kiowa villages with impunity. The Texas Rangers would indiscriminately attack primarily undefended Comanche and Kiowa villages, where they would kill children and regularly rape women. However, this would not stop the Comanche and Kiowa raids on Texas, as the massacres would be met with further retaliatory raids by the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation, with these raids happening between 1840 and 1845 CE. And again, I acknowledge that I am sure that this is going to, this and a lot of things in this video are going to make a lot of people a lot of citizens of Texas angry. However, again, the historical documents from the time period are clear, and just because you don't want these things to have happened doesn't change the fact that they did happen. and actually erasing events, historical events, to make one more comfortable, to make oneself more comfortable, um, is nothing more than essentially cultural genocide and historical erasure. The constant warfare between the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation and the Republic of Texas bankrupts the Republic of Texas and would exhaust both the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation. These, in turn, especially the bankruptance of Texas, would lead to the re-election of Sam Houston, who would then go on to negotiate a peace treaty between the Comanche Nation, the Kiowa Nation, and the Republic of Texas on December of 1845 CE. However, this would actually change to a certain degree, especially with the opening of Comanche-Kiowa relations with the United States, outside, of course, the first peace negotiations in 1835. And this is because in December, at the same time Sam Houston was negotiating the peace treaty with the Comanche and Kiowa nations, the United States would officially annex the Republic of Texas into the United States and make it the state of Texas, specifically doing this on December 29th, 1845 CE. Then, right after this annexation of Texas into the United States would also sign a treaty with the Comanche and Kiowa nations. However, the outbreak of the Mexican-American War would prevent this treaty from being ratified, with the Mexican-American War lasting, with these treaty negotiations being held between 1845 and 1846 CE. Furthermore, feeling that they had no authority to enforce state laws, the United States military would continue to allow Texas Rangers to conduct their brutal raids between 1846 and the 1850s CE. Which actually brings us to this section where we need to examine what the weapons of the Texas Rangers looked like in the 1840s. So generally, in the 1840s, the weapons that were used by the Texas Rangers were primarily variations of the Colt, whether they be the Colt Navy pistol or other versions of the Colt. And then for longer range weapons, the Texas Rangers would use percussion cap rifled muskets. And for up close combat, they would use Bowie knives, and some, not all, but some Texas Rangers would also use cavalry sabers. But despite the stalling of the peace treaties between the Comanche and Kiowa Nation and the United States, and the constant raids by the constant brutal raids by the Texas Rangers, not all would be bad in Texas for the Comanche. And this is because German immigrants led by John Musbach would successfully negotiate a permanent peace treaty with the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation in the Musbach-Comanche Treaty. This treaty would permanently protect the city of Fredericksburg, Texas, from raids by the Comanche and Kiowa warriors. And the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation would never break the treaty, ever, with this treaty being signed on May 9th, 1847 CE. Then another massive turning point for the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation would happen with the discovery of gold in California, which initiated the California Gold Rush. This would prompt white Americans to travel along the Santa Fe Trail through the Comanche and Kiowa Nations to reach California. often protected by the United States military, with the California Gold Rush initiating in 1848 CE. White American gold miners would often purchase horses from the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation, which would then prompt the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation to increasingly raid Texas and Mexico to meet the demands for horses by white Americans traveling to the California Gold Rush, which you can see in this map here. And here's a Comanche war party, raiding party here. Now this brings us to our next section, the aftermath of the United States expansion into Texas. Well, for one thing, the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation would suffer from smallpox and cholera epidemics brought by the white American gold miners traveling through their territories to get to the California Gold Rush. And of course, as we've already discussed a little bit earlier in the video, the United States would allow the Texas Rangers to continue their indiscriminate attacks on Comanche and Kiowa villages well into the 1850s CE. Meanwhile, the United States would begin to build a series of forts in the territories of the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation in the 1850s CE, with the United States officially launching military campaigns and offensives into and against Comanche villages using their newly created light cavalry regiments between 1858 and 1860 CE, with Comanche villages in Oklahoma being the main targets of these attacks. And you might recognize these U.S. light cavalry units because these are generally what we see in, for example, Western movies when depicting the United States cavalry. However, these initial offensives by the United States into the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation would stop as the United States withdrew from Texas at the outbreak of the American Civil War. After that, the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa Nation would remain mostly neutral during the conflict. Which now brings us to our last section. Where are the Comanche and Kiowa today? Starting, of course, with the Comanche. Well, the Comanche Nation is still very much intact, being located in Oklahoma, and they continue to keep their culture alive despite previous and repeated and continued attempts by the United States to eradicate their culture. And the Kiowa, very similarly, are still very much intact as a nation in Oklahoma, and again are keeping their culture alive despite previous, repeated, and continued attempts by the United States to eradicate their culture. All right, that brings us to the end of our video. As I've said in the previous videos, I hope that you enjoyed the parts of this video that are about Comanche and Kiowa culture, but I really hope you did not enjoy the parts that involved epidemics and the committing of genocide against the Comanche and Kiowa nations at the hands of the Texas Republic and the United States. I know, as I've said in the previous videos, that it's very odd to hear the person making this video, to ask you to not enjoy a certain part of it. However, my purpose of bringing up these events, these committing of genocidal acts against the Comanche Nation and Kiowa Nation, as well as other Native American nations, at the hands of the United States and also the Texas Republic, is not for the purpose of entertainment. These are events that are oftentimes overlooked or underplayed, downplayed, or are completely erased from history books in the United States. And these are events that, so they need to be brought up to people. They need to be brought to people's attention, because these are events that should never have happened. And by bringing these events to your attention, and to the attention of others, uh, we can make sure that these events never happen again to any Native American nation or people, period. Okay, so with that in mind, if you want me to cover any of the subjects I mentioned in this video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.